the thing about weight training that makes it so tremendously powerful in terms of putting on muscle mass or holding on to muscle mass is that it's an extraordinary tensile load and metabolically stressful stimulus to the muscle, way outside the norm.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to Muscle Minds with Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McNally. All of our programming is brought to you by you, our Patreon followers. Thank you guys for that. I much appreciate you. We've got links to Patreon below. We're also brought to you by TrueNutrition.com, and you can use our code THINK for some additional savings on get some MPA muscle intrusion and bust your next workout out with that. And if you are in Canada, check out supplementsource.ca for blowout deals on high quality supplements, including get yourself a pack of ephedrine for like $3. How can you not? And go to Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach, BYOBBcoach.com. Get Scott's book while you're at it. You'll have like everything you need between the intra, the ephedrine, and the book, and your subscription to our Patreon. You'll be set to go. How'd you like that pitch, Scott? How you doing, man?
I like that. I'm just concerned people are going to try to like take so much ephedrine that they can read the whole book all the way through and they'll be awake for like a week.
That'd be, yeah, you gotta dose that stuff out.
Meth trip, right?
We've got some listener questions, and I'm excited to get into this, man. We got a lot of really good feedback, by the way. Everybody over at YouTube, I appreciate you guys. Our first question is, as a matter of fact, from Patreon, and this is from Matt. And we've kind of talked about this before, but I thought it'd be a good one to bring up again. He says, I'd love to hear Dr. Thirst Trap's take on how much protein our bodies can absorb at a time. And does being enhanced increase this?
So, absorption in this context, what we're talking about is protein coming from inside the lumen of the digestive tract into the bloodstream. That's going to be our absorption. And if you look across protein, you look across the studies, pretty much up to, I think I've seen up to like 70 grams in a meal. You're going to get everything's going to be absorbed. It's like 90+% almost all the time. If you don't, then you have malabsorption. So you're going to be having some GI issue. If you have like the easiest one to know, well, that's why protein farts come from. To some degrees, you have a little more protein that's making it down to your GI, and the bacteria there are having their way with it, and they're producing gas. If you have, for instance, fat malabsorption, you would literally see fat droplets in the stool because there's malabsorption. You're not getting the fat's not being absorbed into the bloodstream. So the protein's getting absorbed. The main question that really I think people are getting at when they ask this is whether you need more protein if you're enhanced. And this is the interesting thing. Literally, you do the math, and if you are just in a positive protein balance of like, and I've said this I don't know how many times, Cornelius is like he probably could just finish the rest of what I'm about to say here. Something like 7 grams of protein a day, so that's like 28 calories. That gives you, given the muscle is mainly water, 3/4 something like that water. That's going to give you about an ounce of new muscle a day if we're presuming that those 7 grams get incorporated. So you take in 200 grams of protein, and 193 of that is just serving to provide for the normal turnover that you have. But 7 grams of that gets incorporated. It's just 7. It's 28 calories. It's nothing. It's zilch as far as energy in that protein. You're going to need enough energy in the food that you eat, and those estimates are pretty high. You might need an extra 500 calories a day. I've actually kind of done the back calculation on this to create this new muscle growth, and that's going to be highly variable. That gets into the topic of P ratio and those sorts of things. But 7 grams a day gives you an ounce of new protein, new muscle a day, wet, hydrated muscle tissue, which gives you over 20 pounds in a year. That's Damn. Growing like a weed. I know. So it's not a matter of protein. It's a matter of what you do with it, or that you get the protein balance. And this is where you don't see this in the long-term studies. The best we have is Jose Antonio's work where they did really high, over 3 grams per kilogram protein, and you don't see any added effect on muscle growth. You
Okay.
also don't see any body fat that comes with it either, at least on average. Even though they've added like literally it's close to 1,000 calories worth of protein. Protein is so thermogenic and so poorly assimilated as body fat. You can load as much protein as you want in there. The interesting thing is in this study now is his studies have basically demonstrated that with boat loading the protein does not mean more muscle growth. The excess calories in that case were coming just from protein. Here's the interesting thing, and we've talked about this. If you go back to like maybe it's episode 101, 102 to 100 to 102, where we did like those science you should know.
Yeah,
episodes.
it would have been in the nutrition science that you should know episode.
Yeah,
yeah. So
they covered the idea
of
overfeeding, like the Rozenek study, where they were given like a monster, like 1,000 calorie a day caloric excess. That's where you get the energy that's needed to support this protein synthesis, because it's a pretty massive undertaking to actually do that. It's just taking those amino acids or dipeptides that have been broken down and then bringing them in, and then the assimilation into contractile protein and the other structural proteins in the myofilaments, in the myofibrils, in the muscle cells is kind of a big deal. So you need energy. It's sort of like you're at the work site. I use the work site analogy, which always seems to fit really well. If you just bring a bunch of 2x4s and nails and you don't pay the guys to do the extra work, you're not going to get anything faster. Like you're not going to, the houses are not going to get built any better just by having extra building materials around. You need the energy to make that happen. So then going back to the gear deal, the gear idea, the kind of the thrust of the question is, you can grow muscle more quickly. You don't necessarily need more protein to do that because guys have just added in gear, and it's not. We would have probably seen, and this is sort of the empirical. There would have probably been an empirical notion that you don't grow really well unless you jack up your protein if you get on gear. And you want to have enough. Like you don't want to go down to like 50 grams a day or something like that. But if you want to have enough, and the thing that's going on with the gear is you're turning on those protein synthetic processes, and you can get a repartitioning effect. This happens in natties. This is Chris Bearcat's got a nice paper on this, which he took a lot of slack for because he was talking about naturals being able to put on muscle and lose body fat at the same time.
Okay.
And that's been documented. You can see that in individual circumstances. Individuals have good genetics. One thing, genetics is going to determine whether that happens for someone. How hard and how impressive the training stimulus is relative to what was being done before. And the most impressive relative to what was being done before is when you're going from untrained to training for the first time.
Yeah.
And you will often see that. In fact, you can go back like the 50s and look at some of the studies that were done with PE students. There were studies where they compared body composition changes. They split the students up into two groups. One group, these are just untrained students. They just go on a jogging program. They're just running, which is not a profound stimulus for putting on muscle mass. And they compare that with the weight training. And over that, because it's so much more than what they're doing, you basically get the same body comp changes. They're using hydrostatic weighing and those sorts of things, so they're not we're not looking at MRI, cross-sectional area measurements or anything like that, but you'll lose body fat, the average person lose body fat and gain muscle mass just from becoming physically active, doing vigorous activity. So you add the gear in there, that's one of the other circumstances where now you've got a novel stimulus for handling, processing of those nutrients. And this is where you can see guys that, go for these massive transformations and, they put on 10, 15 pounds and hardly gain any body fat. And you can literally be taking energy from from the body fat and using that to as the energy that's required for laying down new muscle tissue. So that's what can happen with someone, especially who's very responsive to the gear. So I see question marks. I think you got a couple.
No, I'm just thinking about it, man. I mean, I've seen it in my own life. And I think I've especially seen it in like long ago. You know, when I feel like the less muscle mass I had, the
Yes.
better I was able to grow while cutting. In fact, my first, second, third contest seasons, I can tell you that after having finished the season and then filled back out, I was bigger and rounder than I was before I had started the contest prep. Like there was no question in my mind,
Oh yeah.
especially early in bodybuilding, that you can jump yourself ahead a level by dieting down for a show, even though it doesn't seem like it at the time because your food's so low and all that. But after you get through it and you come back out the other side, I think it does change your body for the better. And of course, too, I think in my circumstances, it was always with gear. Then when we look at cutting, we think about drugs like Tren, and you've got such a strong drug with Tren. Like, I mean, I've seen that happen multiple times. People losing fat, and you know they're getting leaner and they're getting bigger while on Tren.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not uncommon at all. You know.
Yeah, growing into the show,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's I mean, Dante keeps on coming up, but that's what people would ask, like, what do you suggest? And his basic ideas were use food as your growth,
Yeah.
your substance for growth, not gear. Make sure you're not hypogonadal. Bodybuilder HRT would be kind of like what most of the average person might do, taking on this idea. Some growth hormone to keep your body comp under control, but nothing. You're not blasting with like 3 grams of gear a week or something like that in the off season, but make gains with food and slag iron in the off season.
Yeah.
Get as big and as strong as you possibly can, and then when you add in the sauce and you start dieting down, you keep all that size or you gain some and you lose body fat. And that's where guys would grow into the show and just do these just massive transformations.
Yeah. I feel like training has to be a variable in there too. You know, if you're, because I've worked with people who have, really good results, and then I've worked with people that don't have such good results. And honestly, I've seen a lot of times it's in how hard they train. That somebody who does like really bust their butt in the gym and they're pushing hard, going to failure, and they're progressive with their training, that they end up making better progress in both directions,
Yeah, there is a lot of variability and responsiveness to training. There's non-responders.
So do we make better use of protein if we're training harder?
Yeah, I mean, you could say you've got a better training stimulus, but it's this hormetic curve. So you train harder, and then at some point there's a law of diminishing returns, and you keep on doing too much, and now you've turned on protein breakdown, and you're creating so much inroads into recovery that you're not gonna benefit from that. So. Okay. Yeah, I mean, my general thought, and this is just sort of, and I've said this a million and one times, I feel like a broken record, but the thing about weight training that makes it so tremendously powerful in terms of putting on muscle mass or holding on to muscle mass is that it's an extraordinary tensile load and metabolically stressful stimulus to the muscle, way outside the norm of what anyone does during the course of the day. You don't see even like guys on construction workers or like smart mechanics who might, be underneath the car trying to get some rusted bolts out of the car. And I know this because I've been in this situation. It's like, no, they get better leverage, and they're not there like going, okay, motherfucker, here we go. Whoa! Trying to, like, you're not doing that during the day. There's no efforts that are like what we evoke in the gym.
Yeah.
So it's the quality of that effort. It's the extraordinary force and effort and exertion that you put forth, which evokes for many people muscle growth. The interesting thing that this keeps on occurring to me, and I wish this can be done with some of the gene expression analysis techniques that are available now, is we see on average that people grow well from doing higher rep sets, especially if they're taking a failure, even the blood flow restriction, as well as training heavy, which, so you talk about 80% versus 50% of a 1 rep max. You do those, 30 rep sets, which are brutal. But that's more of a metabolic stress. and it's still enough tension to produce muscle growth. But as I've talked about before, the interesting thing, this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but there's much more. It's such an, and this is connected with what we're talking about. It's such an energetically expensive process to grow new muscle mass.
Yeah.
So one way to make a muscle perform better, given the tasks that you're requiring it to do, is just make a bigger muscle. Then everything's relatively more easy, and you've achieved the goal of the adaptation, is to be able to shoulder the burden of the stimulus or the stress of picking up, of squatting 405 or pressing 2 1/4 or whatever it might be. And if you go lighter and you're trying to do sets of 15 or 20, 25 reps, you can get better at that by improving the muscle endurance capability of the muscle. And you see this, it's interesting, if you look across the various studies that have examined the biochemical adaptations in the muscle cells, you see some have like a lot more growth in the type 2 fibers than the type 1, but you also see a lot of studies with bodybuilders where the type 1s are really, really big. You see some studies with bodybuilders where the type 1s are average size, but they seem to have lots of them. Mm. You see adaptations where just in the short term where you get a lot more capillaries. So one thing is metabolic stress inhibits performance. So if metabolites are accumulating, you can't produce ATP as rapidly during a really high effort set. So you get fatigue. So one way to make a muscle perform better is to improve its fatigue resistance. And you can do that by having more capillaries, clear away those metabolites like lactic acid, ammonia, things like that. And you can increase the enzyme content really rapidly, as well as shift the myosin isoforms that make up the contractile proteins. So you can make a more enzymatically fatigue resistant. So gear it towards those higher rep sets, and a more literally efficient in terms of force that you get at those speeds of contraction, or definitely more economical. You're not really doing work because you're lifting up and lowering down and the work is zero, but you end up expending less energy for producing those sets. So you get better muscle endurance when you're doing high rep sets. And that's a really smart way for the muscle to adapt. And that's the interesting thing, is we've got so much heterogeneity among individuals. Some go in and they lift, and it doesn't matter what they do. The muscles just gets bigger. That's a viable way of growth. It takes a lot of energy, but that's one form of adaptation. It's one solution to the problem of the stress. Another end of the solution possibilities is just to be, and this is where a non-responder hypertrophy wise would come in, is just to increase enzymatic content and capillary density, and make the muscle more fatigue resistant, and not make it bigger, because it takes a lot of energy to do that.
Yeah,
that's where someone who's a hard gainer would come in. It's like they have to really, really eat. You see these guys who, we would call ectomorphs, whatever, and they're 173 pounds, and they're eating over 4,000 calories a day, really eating, and they're pushing as hard as they can, and their bodies just don't want to get bigger.
Yep.
And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, they've got just a genetic propensity for being better at endurance types of activities.
That makes sense.
And we're hunter gatherers. We're somewhat migratory, from an evolutionary standpoint, but that's highly variable. Huh. So, but anyway, the training stimulus is going to change how you process protein, but finding the sweet spot in terms of recovery is where the money's at, because you don't recover.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Are you interested in improving your joint health? Were you aware that a lot of joint health supplements don't actually repair connective tissue? Supplements like glucosamine, MSM, growth hormone. No, actually, wait, growth hormone does a really, really good job. But we're talking about health supplements here today, and I'm talking specifically about hydrolyzed beef collagen from our sponsor, True Nutrition. And if you're using growth hormone, it'll give your body the materials to make it work that much better. Hydrolyzed beef collagen will help you to improve your connective tissue. It's also really popular in the beauty industry because it makes your hair thicker, it makes your nails more dense. But don't take my word for it. You can ask my 71-year-old mom. No, really, I brought her on.
My nails were just driving me crazy because they're growing so fast. My beautician's always saying, it's amazing, how thick my hair is and what good condition it's in. I've just added in my coffee in the morning, which is fantastic. It dissolves really easy. It doesn't change the flavor of your coffee.
Yeah, that really was my mom, and she really is taking hydrolyzed beef collagen from our sponsor, True Nutrition. If you guys want to improve your connective tissue, then I suggest that you take it too. And use our code THINK. You'll get a discount, and you'll help to support our programming. Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
I've got a fun one for you. I got a really fun one. So this is, I don't remember talking about this, but he says, hey, Scott, there was a podcast with Dr. Stevenson done a while back, last year, I think, where he talked about going into the zone when it comes to training. He was very passionate about describing it, highly motivational few minutes. I've been searching for it. Would you remember by chance which podcast it was? Thank you for the podcast. And I like that Cornelius followed it up with, he says, bro, Scott can't remember a conversation that he had only a few hours earlier, which is true because, we record these all the time and they're just conversations, it's an ongoing constant thing. So some of those little details I don't remember, but I have to think that we've gone into that more than once. It did make me think though, because I saw a post by Dusty, and Dusty was asking me about this on one of the previous episodes of It's Just Bodybuilding. He was talking about the importance of rituals before training. And we've talked about that before. And I do feel like, to me, there's a level of like having certain rituals that get me into the zone I need to be into. And I was thinking that maybe we could kind of maybe have a conversation about that, about, what does it take to get into the zone, and how can we basically program ourselves to do that?
There's so much there, man. So there's this, the ritual idea of putting yourself in the right mindset for things. And you can create your own self atmosphere, basically. You can create the bubble that you're in. People who've been at it for a while, and you've probably experienced this. Like you're out of town someplace, and you have to go to a gym, and it's not the gym. Like if you had, a choice of 10 gyms, that one would be the last on your list of ones you'd rather go to because it's just not a hardcore gym. I went to is it Planet Fitness where they have the lunk alarm?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And I have an LA Fitness membership for these circumstances. Yeah. But I was going to a conference, and LA Fitness was a Saturday. LA Fitness wasn't open until 8 or 9, and I had to be at the conference at 9, I think. So I went to Planet Fitness. I had to do it. I walked to the front desk, and a young kid there. He was very polite, and he said he literally told me, he's like, we don't. He said something almost as direct as, we don't allow bodybuilders here.
What? They didn't even let you, like they said that before you, like you didn't even, you did nothing. They just saw you. He's like, that we have it's like the lunk alarm. And I mean, it was very discriminatory. Yeah. No,
but I said, yeah, I can understand that. They can be kind of loud and noisy and intimidate people.
Yeah. So what happened from there?
Well, and then I said, you know what? I know there's a lunk alarm, and I knew that he's going to be watching me. He didn't do one of these things, but
but all but that,
all but that, pretty much. You're like, super nice kid though, just a young guy. He was just following orders pretty much. Mm-hmm. So I went in there and had
just like the Nazi soldiers were just following orders.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic, pretty much. Yeah, normal people. We don't want to get into that. That's way off topic. But I went in there. I had an awesome workout. Did not utter a peep, and I said to myself, "I'm not going to utter a peep."
Yeah.
And I went, and I'm like, it was fortitude training. I think it was it was a day 1 or day 2, so it was a full body.
Yeah.
And I used some machines that I wouldn't normally have access to.
Yeah.
For the pump sets, and I used the stack on everything. I'm like, I'm going to rack every machine in here, and I'm going to just crank out the reps and not utter a peep.
Yeah.
Like nothing. And I just went to town.
That's so cool, man.
Yeah. I think they have a Smith machine in there, and I think I did like rack deads on the Smith. Maybe.
Why don't we have video of this?
And it was awesome. And it was like, I think it only went to like 6 plates on a side, so I loaded it all the way up and cranked out like 14 reps or something like that.
Yeah.
Another peep, pause the bottom, come back up, back and forth. It was just. But it cranked me up. It actually made it motivated me and I took that energy and just transferred it into the training. So yeah, there's ritual and mindset, and you can pick that up on what's around you, or you can just create your own own bubble. So
yeah, because we do get questions like, how do I get motivated? And I do feel like this is maybe a specific answer, because like I train from home. So I think sometimes the ritual is driving to the gym for people and being in a separate place. But more and more people are training from home nowadays. They've had the idea like, hey, I'm just going to buy a rack, and it'll be great. I'll save money. And by the way, you don't save money by buying a home gym, because you just keep buying more shit and it becomes way more expensive than having a membership. But yes. But yeah, I think that it is a question, man. You know what one thing is for me? And I think maybe even if people don't realize it, pre-workout. Pre-workout to me it's like I'm like a Pavlov's dog for training, that I take beta alanine and you can feel it. You get the tingle on your skin. And I know it's like, okay, this is the trigger. For me, it's like, I know it's go time.
Operant conditioning.
Exactly. And I know that I've done that to myself. I don't know if everybody realizes it, but I think that's one of the reasons why pre-workout is so popular, because it's a ritual that you use that before you train. You get a sensation, something changes in how you feel, and you associate that with time to train. And if you repeat that process over and over again, then it just becomes wired,
Yeah, there's expectancies that come about, and like one study it's a placebo effect study that comes to mind that's really relevant here as far as like weathering the pain, so to speak, of the training was one where they would do cold water ice bath immersion and get pain ratings from the subjects.
Yeah, and
so they did the standard like control, and then they used a lidocaine cream, and I think they may have tested out like several different concentrations that would have different amounts of pain reduction from numbing the skin.
Yeah.
And so they could experience that. And then they came back and at some point in time, after they had already created that expectancy that when they add the cream, that was the intent here. They did it with nothing and then added the lidocaine cream, which did have an effect.
Yep.
And then they added a placebo cream, which had no lidocaine in it. And they still had the same effect on reducing pain.
No kidding.
So, yes. Yeah. So you take a pre-workout and you feel it. You can tell it's there.
Yeah.
And, there can be an ergogenic effect from caffeine that's been demonstrated many times. But there's also some really cool caffeine studies where they've taken cyclists and told them they were giving them certain doses of caffeine, and they evoke you can evoke a graded placebo-based performance effect on cycling performance.
No kidding.
The more caffeine you tell them you're giving them, the better they will perform, because cyclists all know that caffeine's an ergogenic aid for cycling. It's the most widely used ergogenic aid probably there is.
Yeah.
So if you believe that, it's go time when when you can feel that, and that sensory perception is huge. So harness that, make use of that. And so you're basically, just like you said, operant conditioning yourself to being in the zone and being mentally and psychologically ready to perform at your best, because you're doing that over and over and over again. Something it was funny. So I'm on some people might know I'm gonna dip into sort of this kind of two things that sort of tie together. I'm on a bunch of German meetup groups because I'm working on my German. I've done a few podcasts now in German. Cornelius, his mother, spoke Schweizerdeutsch, to him, Swiss German dialect, and he said he could understand it, a little bit of this. So when I've done some of these podcasts, and I was on a meetup group, and the question was, or as a formal discussion group, what motivates you? This was just like yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, I think. And I said, well, what's up with this motivation thing? Do you guys even, and I kind of called everyone. I was like, do you guys believe there's such a thing as motivation? Like, what does that actually mean? And motivation is a notion that we have that you can sort of call upon a source of discipline or something like that in some way, shape, or form to get you to do things that you don't want to do or that you wouldn't otherwise do. And really what a lot of it comes down to, in my mind, is that we have reward centers in our brain.
Yeah.
And there's something about the activity, most everything that we do, that you ultimately can trace back to the reward center.
Yeah.
And
sure.
One thing, and I'm taking this because this was a really, really well expressed notion from the Mark Drussel podcast, and I've been on Mark's podcast twice now, I think. And he brings on a guest who's a brilliant guy, German, named Frank Teger. If Frank is listening, then Servus Frank. And they were talking about this idea, and one of the things, they had a really lively conversation, and I totally resonated with it. And Mark was talking about, basically, he was creating an icon in his mind when he was dieting down for, I think, the last time he got on stage, is like, I'm a bodybuilder and I do this shit. And that's what happens when you go in the gym, is like, I'm a fucking warrior. I don't give a rat's ass how hungry I am. I don't give a rat's ass how heavy the weight is, how heavy it feels. This shit is getting moved. Gravity is my bitch.
Yeah.
And that's a rewarding thing, because you are bringing into your mindset that this is what you do. As painful as it may be, that you bring this unto yourself.
Yeah.
And that feeds into your reward center, because you're reiterating your sense of self. You're reinforcing your sense of self in a certain way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's totally fine. You do things that make you that resonate with who you think you are or who you think you want to be.
That makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's one of the, I don't want to get too deep here, but I feel like that with progressive overload, we can tie our sense of identity to having overcome and achieved that challenge. And that's what I think can be so stressful for some people who don't like progressive overload, because having to challenge yourself at that level every time you train, or, on a real regular basis, it's a lot of pressure to live up to kind of maintain that. You know what I mean?
I mean, you can listen to a multitude of interviews and speeches from Jordan Peterson, where he talks about the hero archetype.
Yeah.
That pervades, so many of our myths and our stories and our movies and our culture, of like overcoming the obstacle, like the Rocky. Rocky is like a timeless story of the underdog.
Yeah.
So that's what you are, in a sense. You're an underdog who's overcoming. In this case, that's why I like to say gravity is my bitch. Like, you're actually going to beat gravity. Like, this is one of the, it's a primal force of nature. Like, that's just, gravity is gravity. No one even knows exactly why it is what it is. It's like beating God in an arm wrestling match. Like, how do you do this? Because like gravity is just gravity. But you're reifying that sense, and that's a really, in my mind, that's a really important part of living a good life, is to feel like that's one of the things that humans do well. It doesn't resonate with everyone. Being, like, I said this to someone the other day too, like, one of the most beautiful things you can do is be an extraordinary mother. That's like being, or a father, being a parent is just it's a built-in aspect of being an amazing human being, is being really good at that, because that perpetuates a species. That's being human.
Yeah.
And being a hero, under whatever circumstances you have, is part of being a good human, I think, or living a good life. And we don't have necessarily, especially in modern society, those challenges. I think that's why we do what we do.
Yeah.
Is so that we can have something to overcome. If there's nothing, then life is boring if there's no challenges.
All
We're
right.
wired for taking on challenges. I have a couple more sciencey things to add to this, though. And
Okay.
that's
Okay, cool.
mental imagery and mental rehearsal are important too. So I've talked about this before. There's a couple of different models of mental imagery, mental rehearsal, and basically you can break things down in different ways. But when you're getting ready for a set or going into a set, or getting ready for whatever performance task you might have at hand, visualizing that with as much detail as you possibly can, sensory detail, internal and external. So what you feel with the bar, how you feel inside, what you might feel when you're getting toward the end of the set and you're like, oh shit, this shit's getting heavy. Visualizing the thoughts and the perception that you want to have of driving through that pain or what have you. Having done all that before, really literally lived that out previously, is something that actually lights up the same motor neurons in the motor cortex as that you use during the actual movement. You can actually get stronger just from mental rehearsal. There's a number of studies that have demonstrated that.
I can
Just
see
from
that.
practicing. Yeah, like literally they do no training and they grow or they neither grow, they don't grow, but they get just as much strength gains just about as those who actually do the training. So you can do all that beforehand, and that way, like imagine if you just walked up to like a heavy squat effort, like a Widowmaker or something like that, cold turkey, and just went under it.
Yeah.
You'd have to like orient yourself during the set to what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
But if you walk up and this is what I do, this is maybe what he was referring to. Especially for the big sets, I visualize everything about the set, like how the bar feels when I grab a hold of it, how that first rep feels, how I turn it up a notch as the set progresses towards the end, and how I a lot of times I'll even see numbers beyond what are even reasonable, but I don't ever have a doubt in my mind that I'm going to get those. So sometimes I'll just say I'm getting fucking 20, and it's something I'm going to get like 12 with maybe, but I just go for 20.
Yeah.
And I'll end up getting like 14.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm sure if I thought, hopefully I'll get 10,
Right.
that doesn't work. You don't do that. So having mentally seen in your mind's eye what it is you're about to accomplish means you've just done it. From a neurological perspective, you've largely just done it. So any doubts, like the worst thing you want to have is you get in a set and you're like, oh shit, this is crushing me, or you pick up a heavy weight and you're like, oh God, like that doesn't behoove better performance. You want to have already done that and been in the right mindset mentally in the mental rehearsal before you actually do it. And then you're doubling your practice, at least if you just do one round of mental rehearsal for every actual set.
Yeah.
So that's maybe what the original question was getting at too, is everything from like how does the bar feel and where does your weight belt go and how does your hands feel, and like do you typically start to lose your grip? Well, what do you do, to accommodate that? Do you know that you're going to stop and re-wrap, your straps again as the reps get to the end? So you just do that. It doesn't distract you because you've already seen it coming.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you already know the route. Like, you're going to have a really hard left after you make that last right turn.
Yeah.
So you see it in your mind's eye, and then you're ready for it, and then you just fucking do it because you've already done it.
Yep. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, so that's super, super helpful. And once you've done that for, 40 years, my case, or 20 years, like I think we tallied up, like, I don't know how, it's like so many, like 20,000 workouts or something like that.
Oh my
you
God.
add them all up. Something like that. Yeah, it's a lot. You've got a lot of reps, of
Sure.
those sets. So that's important too, I think.
I would agree.
Yeah.
So we had one, and I think this is it. It was related to diuretics.
It's a big one.
Yes, this is from Chris. He says, always love the Scott and Scott episodes. I got a question for the next episode. Could Scott talk about diuretics and how they work? Simplified. Where the danger lies, what a smart protocol would be, and a stupid question: would you drink more if you take one of those strong diuretics, keep fluid intake the same, or reduce it. And then he adds, he says, just purely for educational reasons, I have no plans to ever use them. They only hinder my performance on the mat.
Yeah. So this is when I sent, I think, 3 images. So that second one that I sent is the one I think we can pull up.
Okay.
So
I think I only got one. Oh no. I got two.
Two colorful ones. The second colorful one is the one.
Okay. I think I have 2. So is this the one you wanted first?
Yeah, that one there. You can probably make that just as big as possible.
All right.
So, first and foremost, I have never had anyone I've ever worked with use diuretics. I've had a couple athletes just throw them in, even though I warned them against it, and I've had to actually fire a person or two because you can get so dry using basically the protocol that is in my book, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book, and it's also in the paper that came out last year, which you can find linked to my Instagram on Peak Week for bodybuilders. So you don't really need them for dropping water during the week if you know how to manipulate things and you have a practice run. So, but. And this is it's a very hard thing to simplify. This was the best figure I could get. There's some better figures out there, but they're copyrighted, so I didn't want to use those. This one was from Wikimedia Commons.
Okay.
This is one of the most difficult topics to cover in anatomy and physiology. It's renal physiology, and what we have here is the renal the nephritic tubule, which is part of the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney. So you've got thousands and thousands of these things in a good, healthy kidney. And we can kind of start from left to right. They don't really look quite like this. They're highly convoluted. And but this is a very simplified version. I apologize if people can't see this terribly well. That was just the best figure I could get without violating a copyright.
It looks good. It looks good.
Yeah, if you can make it any bigger, that would probably help. Like literally cover. Yeah, there we go. That's cool. So you can see Haisuk there on the bottom right is the person who created this, and I added some things. So it's a really pretty cool system. So if that thing on the upper left there that looks kind of like a 2-fingered hand, sort of little pincer, that's the renal capsule or not the renal capsule. That's where the glomerulus is. So that little kind of black thing in there he basically has left out a lot of what's important, but it's okay. It simplifies the figure. What comes into there is something called the glomerulus, which is a specialized fenestrated capillary that acts as a filter to filter the blood. So the blood that comes into the kidney goes to the capillaries that feed to each of these nephrons. So this is just one nephron. Like I said, there's thousands of these things. And the first things that happens there is you get a really gross filtration of what's in the blood into the tubule of the nephron there. Okay. So that yellow thing is the tubule. And what happens there, the top part is the cortex, which means bark, which is the outer portion of the kidney, and the medulla is the inner portion. And from the outside to the inside, there's concentration gradients, and this becomes very, very complicated. We don't even have time to go into all of it. It's very, very cool. But the basic idea that happens here is step one is simple filtration into the tubule there. And at the start, you have it's a convoluted tubule, which means it kind of squirms all around. There's a proximal one. Then that U-shaped thing there in the middle is the loop of Henle. And you can see that it's labeled there. I kind of got the red circle going around it. That's the first action of the diuretics that we're really interested in. There's some that can act on the proximal convoluted tubule, but those really aren't used that often for bodybuilding. And then there is a distal convoluted tubule. So the tubule goes down into the medulla with the loop and comes back up, and then it squirms around a bit. That's the DCT. As you can see, it's labeled up there. And then finally, once that fluid is to the point where it's just about to leave, it goes into a collecting duct, and that's kind of the last passage. And those collecting ducts then feed down into what are called the calyces of the kidneys, and then they eventually go into the ureters and then into the bladder. So what's in the yellow there is what you could call urine, but it still goes through a bunch of filtration. What happens is there's movement across the membrane of the tubule to, which you don't see here, these paratubular capillaries. So this is the cool part. What happens here is you have various places where you can have, first you filter a bunch of the blood into the tubule, and then you get sodium and water follows salt that makes its way out. So that's called secretion. And then it can be brought back in, which is called reabsorption. So there's multiple checkpoints where basically what's in that tubule, in terms of the concentration of sodium and the amount of water and the amount of fluid that actually ends up being lost in the urine, can be changed. So there's more sodium movement at the beginning than at the end of this whole pathway.
Okay.
The loop of Henle is where you have loop diuretics acting. And there's about where about 25% of the sodium handling happens. The more sodium you move around, the more water you're moving around. So loop diuretics, these would be like our good old friend Lasix,
Yeah.
furosemide, act there. And because there's a lot of sodium movement, this is a place where you can potentially keep water in the tubule, which means you lose it as urine. So that's the most powerful, basically, of the diuretics that we use in bodybuilding. Then, as you move from left to right and you go back up into the distal convoluted tubule, you've got like 5 to 10% of the sodium load is moved around there. And that's where the thiazide, which is hydrochlorothiazide, is just sort of your primary example. That's where those diuretics act. Same basic mechanism. We're just keeping water in the tubule by disallowing the sodium from getting out of there. So the water can't get out and be reabsorbed. It stays outside of the tubule, and then would go back into the blood. But if you prevent that process, which is what the diuretic does, it stays in the tubule and it gets lost as urine. And then finally, near the end of the distal convoluted tubule, you're going to have potassium-sparing diuretics. And what these do is block aldosterone or aldosterone's action. So those then keep potassium from being lost. When you exchange sodium, you're also exchanging potassium. So you prevent the loss of potassium when you block the action of aldosterone. So you spare the potassium, you don't lose it. And that's where these are going to have their action. So that's like spironolactone, which has a bunch of other actions as well, on steroid synthesis, and triamterene. So diazide, which is the one that most people will use aldactone too. But diazide, for instance, is triamterene, which is a potassium-sparing diuretic, and hydrochlorothiazide. So you've got the strength of the thiazide diuretic, which is acting a little bit further up before you lose the urine in the distal convoluted tubule. But you got that potassium-sparing action that comes with the triamterene. So the way out, then, you can, on the far right there is where the collecting duct and tubule is, and that's where, for instance, ADH would act. Vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. That's another hormone that comes from the posterior pituitary. Atrial natriuretic peptide acts there. So natriuresis means loss of sodium. If you lose sodium, you lose water too. The natriuresis leads to diuresis because natrium or sodium follows or water follows salt. So anytime you lose sodium, you lose water as well. So all those arrows are showing the movement of things like bicarbonate and protons and potassium back and forth. So you've got this really pretty cool system where you've got concentration gradients that are different in the cortex versus the medulla, and you've got different transport systems throughout the entire tubule. And that loop of Henle serves to dive down and make use of the difference in concentrations on the outside the cortex versus the inside the medulla, so that you can move the ions back and forth and change the concentration of what's in the tubule and secrete, meaning take stuff out of the tubule, or reabsorb, meaning bring stuff back into the tubule so that it'll be lost as urine. So that's the basic general idea. And it's but you can see there's different hormones that act here. Blood pressure makes a difference too. At the very beginning of this whole deal, you've got this gross filtration. So the kidney filters about like 20% of the blood that goes to it. So there's a lot of blood, a lot of fluid from the blood that gets to the kidney that makes it into these nephrons initially. But a lot of it doesn't make its way out. Otherwise, if 20% of you'd be just peeing continuously and you'd be dehydrated in a matter of hours. So a lot of what this is just sort of lots of exchange of electrolytes and fluid so that you can have options depending on what the body needs, depending on what the hormones are telling things to do. But the drugs, the loop diuretics and the thiazides are the stronger ones because they're acting on areas where there's more sodium exchange and thus more fluid exchange. And if you're inhibiting if you're preventing the secretion or keeping the fluid out of the loop, out of the tubule, then you're gonna have lots of it lost, and you're gonna have more diuresis. So you have a stronger diuretic. So that's the basic idea. So he asked, does it make sense, Scott?
None of it.
Generally?
No.
Yeah.
None of it.
It's really, really complicated. Yeah.
I tried. I'm sorry. I didn't get it.
It's tough, dude. And probably most won't. You have to look at it. I remember when I first tried to learn that, I'm like, this is fucking crazy.
Yeah.
So you have to understand, in order to really get that, you have to have had an understanding of how those transport exchangers work, because sodium's moving one way, potassium's moving the other way, and there's bicarbonate and protons. Yeah. So there's a basic and acidic. It's like, oh my God, it's highly, highly complicated. And you've got the hormonal influence, the blood pressure influence. So it's a super complicated, like a pool filtration system.
Yeah.
That didn't just work with chlorine, but it worked with like 4 or 5 other things.
Okay.
So that's why. So the question is, should you keep drinking water or not? What a lot of people like to do, I don't use these at all. So like I'm one of the last persons to ask. I mean, I understand the physiology and the pharmacology very loosely, but you don't need to do that. You can just manipulate the physiology to get really, really dry. Is because the drugs could be very, very strong. You just keep everything consistent and add the drug. So keep the water intake the same, add the drug, let the drug do the work, so to speak.
Yeah.
If you reduce your water and add the drug, then you're changing 2 things. And so you've got more to juggle at one time.
True.
That's why you'll see the guys. It's not always the case, because when you get really, really lean, you tend to hold less water, which, it's just true for everybody. But a lot of times, especially in non-tested shows where you see the guy who's drinking a bunch of water backstage, he probably took a diuretic.
Yeah.
and he's got enough diuretics in his system that he needs to do that to keep from becoming overly diuresed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I've had it happen where people need to keep that when you get so lean, even without using diuretics, you have to keep drinking water or you lose that fullness,
exactly. Exactly. And then the horror story is someone's in really, really good shape.
Yeah.
And they're doing great. It's like, oh, it just took a half a Diazide the night before, and they flatten out like a motherfucker.
Right.
Because they didn't need that. They just, the water they would have lost overnight would have been plenty.
Yeah, we always want to do extra, We always want to keep pushing it further. And what if, it comes down to that what if.
Yeah. Yeah. They're shooting for the A+.
Yeah.
Because we're obsessive compulsive about it all. And that's the thing, as I always say, is like the diuretics, especially if you're, doing like the aldactone right off the bat, that type of thing. For 5 days or what have you, there's kidney stress makes it such that you really don't entirely recover normal water homeostasis for days.
Okay. Yeah.
So you can't really practice this kind of a protocol very effectively.
That makes sense.
Things are different. You never really get to the same starting point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to kind of wing it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. You really do, don't you?
Yeah. But when you do it the way it's in the paper and in my book, you can do this. You could do it every week. I've had the most I've ever had anyone do it was my buddy Mike. I think he did it 7 times in the last 10 weeks before a show.
No kidding. Wow.
Because he was in shape.
Yeah.
And you get leaner. You get leaner doing it the way, as it turns out, as well. The way I've set things up with the getting ready for the carb up, and you don't lose any time in terms of getting in shape for the show. And he just wanted to practice it. The more you practice it, the better, more comfortable you become with it. So your nerves don't play a role anymore.
Yeah.
And you can just keep doing it. In fact, another example that I mentioned many times from Dave Henry is back in the day when Dave was when he was with Muscle Tech, for instance. So he'd do the Olympia. I think it was maybe when he won the 202. So he did the 202, and then he did the Olympia the next day, if I'm remembering this correctly.
Oh,
they let him do that, yeah. And then he had a photo shoot on Sunday, a photo shoot on Monday, and a photo shoot on Tuesday. It's just 5 days of peaking in a row.
That's crazy.
And all we did, though, was things were temporally about the same. He was on stage about the same time, and the photo shoots weren't all over the place. We just repeated the same process each day.
Yeah.
Of watching his weight, carbing him up based on what he had done, and then cutting his water, 6 o'clock, something like that. Knowing what that does to his body weight and his body water.
Yeah.
Because he was so lean already. And he literally was peaking every single day. No problem. Because none of those manipulations were he was using caffeine, but nothing outside of a normal habitual use.
Yeah.
He wasn't taking any diuretics to evoke a pharmacologically super physiological level of dehydration.
Yeah.
We were just manipulating water and sodium and carbs and throughout the day, and using the head down tilt technique.
Okay, so he was using it even back then, huh?
Oh yeah, I came up with that a long time ago. Yeah.
Okay, huh?
Yep. Yeah.
Do you remember what he used to prop his bed up? He would have been in a hotel room at the time?
He was probably using phone books. He used whatever was available, like me.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
I used
cool.
to use the ironing board a lot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sometimes the ironing board didn't weather it terribly well, but yeah, I'd use the ironing board. I get phone books and then the ironing board. Keep it not extended up because then the legs wouldn't handle. But when it was compacted down, a lot of them, then they're pretty solid, and that gives you an extra, 5-6 inches. And if you have a couple phone books, you just say, I don't have a phone book in my room. They bring another phone book, Yellow Pages, so you got 2 of them. So you could get 10, 12 inches that way. That's
funny. That's great.
Yeah.
I didn't realize they were using it back then.
Yeah, I first learned about some of that back in the early 90s.
Okay.
When looking into, it was from this NASA's work originally is where I first learned about it, because they're trying to simulate space flight.
Right. Yeah. No. That when you explained it, you had said that, but I didn't realize that your understanding of it had gone back that far. That's cool.
Yeah. Victor Convertino he gave a few lectures. He worked for NASA. He was like their main guy.
All right. Well, listen, let's wrap this thing up, and then I know we had some other fun stuff that we're going to do. So if the live people are here, you guys hang in here because we're going to do something really fun next. But before that, let me say thank you to everybody for tuning in to Muscle Minds. We appreciate you guys. Check out Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach Scott's book. You can learn about head down tilt, diuretics, not to use them, and a bunch more. Go to byobbcoach.com, and of course check out our sponsors, truenutrition.com. Use our code THINK, and go to supplementsource.ca. Oh, and you can go to amino-asylum.com. Use our code THINK there to get yourself some L-carnitine. Scott, as always, it has been a pleasure, my friend.
Likewise.